I love the text scripture. It'd be great if we could put it up on the screen there. The part that Don read where it says, become friends with God, he's already become a friend with you, which is my proof that God is on Facebook. Do you know what I mean? Would that be something? God has asked to be your friend. Really? Okay, now there you are. Confirm? Wait. How many of us are in that spot? Am I close enough, God? Because when you read this text, you begin to realize that God didn't wait for you to make up your mind. Wow, I think. Wow. A number of years ago, a Filipino student came from the Philippines directly to Regina, Saskatchewan, where Ambrose Seminary was, and became a student and got a meal ticket, went into the cafeteria where they had a salad bar and an ice cream bar, all you could eat. This was one good cafeteria, right side by side, and he had never been confronted with food served this way. And all of the salad dressings and all of the syrups were in the same kind of containers, right side by side. We asked him in just a friendly international students meeting once, what was culture shock like for you coming to Canada? Because a lot of our students were going to other nations and they were trying to deal with what it would be like for them. And he said, a culture shock was vanilla ice cream with Thousand Island dressing. I kind of get that, you know? Because if anyone's a new immigrant to Canada, there's a whole new world, right? Yeah. The old has passed away. The new is coming. And you're in it. You got to sort it out. Another friend of mine, a seminary student, who in his younger days, let's just say as he relates the story, he sowed his wild oats. And you could fill in the blanks. One day he came to faith in Jesus Christ and experienced what you would call a sudden conversion. In other words, he went from darkness to light. I realize sudden conversions can never happen in 100%. There's a whole lot of learning that goes after that. But that immediate behavior changed. And he began to fly straight. One day, a friend came to him and talked to him about a certain woman that lived in his small community. She was the kind of woman that most of the men in town dreamed of and wouldn't even bother asking because they thought she's so high above me. You know that, the way that goes? And she was a woman of faith. She wasn't going to date anybody who wasn't. And this man suggested to my friend, now converted, you ought to ask her out. And he immediately said, she's not interested in a guy like me. To which the man proposing it said, she's interested in the man you are now. Because you see, if anybody's in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has passed away. The new has come. That was a new thought to it. Just to complete the story, he asked her out. They're married. He's serving in pastoral ministry. Like I said, if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creation. She's a new creation. She is a new creation. Not gonna be, is a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. For those of us who didn't sow our wild oats in quite so manifest a fashion, it takes a little bit of searching to discover how it is that you're new, but you are. And then to discover what's the new creation like. Let me just press it a little further. Because as this text speaks in the message, it talks about people becoming new, but the real, I think, and best translation of the word here is, if anyone's in Christ, everything has become new. There's a whole new creation, not just the person within it. Everything has become new, which means your whole perspective on everything has to change. Now, that's trouble. Because all of a sudden, it means that the way I used to see people and things and the world and the earth and the way we do things is all up for revision. St. Paul said it was even true of Jesus. I used to look at everybody, he says, after the flesh, from a human point of view, a worldly fashion, which means basically human point of view, looking always for an advantage. Regarding people as the good connections that I can make. And I even looked at Jesus Christ in that way as a good connection to get rid of. Because as he relates his own story, I persecuted the church. Jesus Christ was unto me an enemy. I hunted him down and killed him. Until one day, on my way to do that, I was knocked right off my pins, flat in my back and blind, and a voice spoke to me that said, Saul, which was my name then, why are you persecuting me? I love this part of the Bible. Mr. Arrogant, Mr. Know-it-all, Mr. Confidence, flat in his back and can't see a thing, says, who are you, Lord? Look, I don't know. I just got dialed back to zero. That's what I call it. The start of a conversion. I don't think it was the end of it. I think rather it was his vocation, because he spent the next 3 years of his life revising everything and came out of that saying, the gospel I hated is now the one that saved me. The people I killed are now my family. And I'm called to preach the gospel I denied. Is that what you call a flip-flop? I'd call it a revolution. And that was his position. If anyone's in Christ, it requires you to revise every thought you ever had. Even about the Bible. He had a PhD in Old Testament. I could just see him 3 years in the desert. Let's read this again. What did it really say? Read the book of Romans and discover his revision of all of Jewish history. Unbelievable. From now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. How did all this happen? What made the change? How can there be a new creation? How can the old be gone and the new has come? All this came from God. All of it came from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ. God became a reconciler. Now, in my world, God's always on trial. I love the old movie, Oh God, because in it, there was Valerie Harper played God. And who was it? George Burns. I realize we're going back. But George Burns is the person who's interviewing God and says to her, why do you allow evil? And she says, I don't. You do. Which is the truth, really. And doesn't answer all the questions, but it does rather throw the discussion open a little wider, doesn't it? Reconciliation's everybody's business. And God's offended, and God's alienated. But the gospel is that God has reconciled himself to us. And he has done so through the cross. And he has given us a ministry of reconciliation. Just a few verses before this, St. Paul said, I've come to this conclusion. If one died for all, that would be Jesus Christ. If God recognized that death as applying to everyone, then it does apply to everyone. We're all dead. That is, we have all come to an end in the old life, and there's a new one born, which means that I can no longer pick and choose the attitude I have towards other people. Just can't be done. I have to look at everybody and the whole creation as though we'd started fresh and something new's coming. My son married a woman whose parents raised beef cattle in Manitoba, and who came to faith in Christ and said to themselves, if we follow Jesus and there's a new world, what difference would that make to the way we raise beef cattle? And the short story was, they answered that question by raising organic beef. But back when they did it, nobody knew what that was. So they founded the Organic Producers Association of Manitoba and began erecting the legal structures, the regulations, the pathways that allowed organic producers to grow. Because they said, if I follow Jesus, it's not just about human relationships, people to people, it's about people to the earth. Everything's become new. And that was their answer about living in the new creation. Unfortunately, that man died way before I got to know him. I would have loved to have heard his story, but he died around my age. And I attended his funeral in a small church in the prairies that had the sanctuary full and closed circuit TV in every room in the place. Just so that all of the people he influenced could be present. It was packed. I'll never forget the minister who led it saying, most of you will not be aware that all of the ways in which Alex's life touched yours, especially as producers in this province, were because of his Christian faith. Because he followed Jesus and believed in a new creation, he had done all of this. It was not simply relevant in his personal relationships and in his family and his church. It was in his relationships, in his business life, and everything he did. Old things were passed away for Alec. All things were become new. And I thought, when I die, if so many people at so many different places on the dial with respect to Christ could hear that kind of a witness, I'd be happy. The old's gone, the new's come. The cross of Jesus Christ has put an end to things. This is Lent, Lent 4. I really appreciate preaching because it forces me into Lent and to consider the texts. So I look at myself in the mirror and say, how are you doing in the new creation, Peter? I think I see some of the old creation hanging off you here and there. We're headed to the cross. What needs to die in you that Christ and his new creation might come more fully into your life? Good question. All this is from God, who has not only reconciled us to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. Not counting people's sins against them. This is God who has done this. This is God who has wiped the slate clean. This is God who has canceled the debts. If somebody had announced to me that that were true and that I was about to meet him that afternoon, I'd wonder, what attitude do you have? What expectation of me do you make? Where is this taking me? What am I supposed to do? Because it's quite clear that the appeal that's being made to us through St. Paul is simply this. I want you to be reconciled to a reconciling God. I want you to realize that God has changed. That God, who has erased all of the offenses and all the barriers that exist between himself and you, now calls you into a new creation where you are called to do the same to each other. And to be reconciled to God is not simply to say, thank you for my forgiveness. It is to extend it to another person. It is to extend it to the world and ask, is the way I'm living and the way I'm treating people, the attitudes that I have, the actions that I take, consistent with a reconciled and reconciling God? Or am I still on the wrong page? Wow. That's what the cross is all about. It's about moving from the old into the new and then beginning to deal with the issues. All of the hymns I ever sang about the cross were ones that guaranteed me peace, but I've discovered that the real cross often brings me challenges, difficulty, strife, and the requirement to change. How awkward. But that's the challenge that lies before us. That's the gospel that he has given us. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. God put the wrong on him who never did anything wrong so we could be put right with God. Becoming righteousness in the world and becoming his servants and learning to live in reconciliation to a God who reconciles us to other people is part of the challenge that lies before us in this Lenten season. Let me give you a couple of examples. A number of years ago, a young woman who came from an extraordinarily dysfunctional home where there was a lot of heartbreak, a lot of neurosis, a lot of abuse, came to faith in Jesus Christ and moved into the home of her pastor together with himself and his wife and learned to sit down at things as radical as regular meals and no yelling and singing. And yes, they read the Bible and prayed, but just a normal life where Jesus Christ rules in hearts and people love each other. And she loved it, and she embraced it, and she embraced Christ, and she grew in grace and became so much like the people with whom she lived. And she also became extraordinarily aware that there was a great gulf fixed between what she now knew and what home knew. And one day came to that pastor and wife and said, "I'm leaving. I'm going back to hell." Because it's one thing for me to be reconciled with God. It's another thing for me to bring that reconciliation home. And she got it. You can't bathe in the reconciliation of God and not walk out into the world that desperately needs it and keep it to yourself. Doesn't happen. The reconciling God's out there. Second one is like it. A woman, my experience, a dear, sweet woman. The very mention of her name in my family is the mention of a saint. Married very young to a man older than herself, at another age and another time. The phone rang one day in her simple home, and on the end of the phone was a Christian man somewhere else whom she knew, married, who began to pressure her sexually over the phone. I don't know what he thought he was doing. But she engaged in conversations with him that she ought not to have engaged in, and he had no right to call forth from her. And at length, not listening to the voice inside her that said, "Hang up." All of this broke out in that man's home on the 16th birthday of his daughter. And for her 16th birthday present, her vision of her dad as a loving father and a faithful husband was torn to pieces and thrown away. Something that would affect her relationships for years and years and years and years. Nothing was ever done to make that situation right. And I would come into her life much later and only hear the story because she told me. Does she know the forgiveness of sins? Yes. Did the wife offended by that husband, no forgiveness of sins. Yes, I knew them both. And the daughter, now a full-grown woman with family of her own, did they know forgiveness of sins? Yes, I knew them all. And they would have said yes. And you could well have said it's all over and done and it's past and it's decades old. And it was. But knowing a reconciling God often keeps you on the hook until there is liberty, and liberty often means liberty in someone else's life. You want me to increase this? These two women, the one on the end of the phone and the 16-year-old with a shattered life, were present in the same congregation Sunday by Sunday. Knew one another by name. Children known by name. And this history simply allowed to lie somewhere in the past like an unburied body. Until one Sunday following church, seeing a moment, the older woman went to the younger and said simply, "Can you ever forgive me for what I did all those years ago?" And the younger woman said, obviously surprised at the request, "I don't know." And began in that moment the long, hard process of reconciliation. When we not only extend forgiveness but acknowledge our offense and enter into the kind of reconciliation that God creates. The kind of reconciliation that God creates is one in which he pays for it out of his own pocket. We enter into Lent, which takes us to the cross and also takes us to the resurrection. And we free other people to be reconciled to God and to us and to each other. We take seriously the offenses that we have done. We also take seriously the requirement for us to live in a new world, and we give somebody else permission to enter it. And by doing so, we come to know the God who was in Christ, not in heaven, not on earth, in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. God bless you.